Welcome to our channel, where we dive into the untold stories of history's darkest moments. Tonight, we're exploring a particularly grim chapter in Victorian London, the lives of children forced into exploitation and labor. Children, often from the poorest families, were pushed into work from a very young age, filling the streets and factories, all while enduring conditions that are hard to imagine today. The jobs they took on were often dangerous, grueling, and done under oppressive conditions. This video will explore the various jobs children did during this time, how they were exploited, and the emotional and physical toll it took on them. Before we dive into the details, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video to help us continue telling these important stories. We also love hearing from you, so comment below and let us know from which location you're watching this video. The Victorian era was a time of extreme contrast. Great wealth and progress for some, but suffering and deprivation for many others. One of the most disturbing features of this time was the widespread exploitation of children. The rapid growth of cities and industries created a demand for cheap labor, and children were seen as the perfect workers, small, quick, and easily manipulated. Many were forced to work in dangerous conditions, often in places that were meant for adults, and they were paid a pittance for their labor. The children of London were subjected to this brutal reality, where their lives were dictated by the need to survive. In Victorian London, the Industrial Revolution had transformed the city into a bustling hub of factories, mills, and workshops. But it also created a large gap between the rich and the poor, with a growing number of families living in abject poverty. For many of these families, the workhouse was not an option, and their children had to find work in order to help make ends meet. Children as young as 5 or 6 were sent to work, often in dangerous and exhausting jobs that adults would refuse. One of the most common jobs for children in Victorian London was working in factories. Factories were some of the largest employers of child labor during the era, particularly in the textile industry. Cotton mills, wool factories, and spinning mills employed children to perform tasks that adults simply could not do because of the machine's intricate and dangerous mechanisms. Children worked long hours, often 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, operating the machinery or repairing broken parts. The work in these factories was relentless. Children were often put in charge of running the machines, or they would have to clean and maintain them while they were still in motion. The machinery in these factories was massive, and it was often dangerous. Children would get their hands or clothing caught in the machines, leading to horrific injuries or even death. There were very few safety regulations in place, and factory owners cared little for the well-being of their workers. The children were seen as expendable. Their small size allowed them to crawl between the machines and pick up the cotton or wool that fell on the floor, making them even more valuable to factory owners who wanted to minimize wasted material. These children worked in filthy and unsanitary conditions, with poor ventilation and little access to fresh air. The mills were often cramped and dark, and the air was thick with dust and fibers from the machinery. This exposure to cotton and wool dust led to lung diseases like chronic bronchitis and tuberculosis. Many children developed these diseases at an early age, and their health often deteriorated rapidly. Despite their exhaustion and deteriorating health, they were forced to keep working, as their families depended on the meager wages they brought home. Another common job for children during this time was working as chimney sweeps. This job was particularly brutal and dangerous. Boys as young as 4 or 5 were hired to climb up the narrow chimneys of homes and factories to clean the soot that built up inside. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. The children would climb up the chimneys barefoot, often using nothing but their hands to scrape away the soot. Many children became ill from inhaling the soot, and the narrow chimneys often led to accidents where children became stuck, suffocated, or fell to their deaths. Children employed as chimney sweeps were typically forced to work long hours in cramped, uncomfortable conditions. They were often locked inside chimneys for hours at a time, unable to move or stretch. This caused many children to develop physical deformities, such as spinal problems, limb deformities, and breathing issues. Many of these children were also physically abused by their employers, who used them as tools to earn money rather than considering their well-being. In addition to factory work and chimney sweeping, many poor children in Victorian London also worked as apprentices to tradesmen. These children were often bound to a tradesman from an early age, working for little or no pay in exchange for learning the trade. The work was often brutal, and children were forced to do the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs. For example, apprentice bakers were responsible for carrying large sacks of flour, tending the ovens, and cleaning the bakery. Apprentice blacksmiths would be assigned to heavy lifting, hammering metal, and working with dangerous tools. The work was often exhausting, and the children were forced to work long hours with little rest. The majority of these children lived in poor, overcrowded conditions. Many were forced to sleep in the same rooms where they worked, in homes that were barely big enough for the families who lived in them. There was little room for personal space, and hygiene was nearly non-existent. Diseases like cholera, typhus, and dysentery spread quickly in these unsanitary conditions. Many children fell ill and died before they could escape the harshness of their lives. The wealthy, on the other hand, lived in luxury, completely unaware of the suffering of the children working in the factories, chimneys, and workshops of London. They were able to send their children to school, hire servants, and enjoy comfortable lives. The inequality between the rich and the poor was vast, and the poor children were often viewed as a necessary part of the system that kept the economy running. They were seen as little more than tools, exploited for their small size and ability to work long hours. Despite the hardships, many of these children found ways to survive. They formed close-knit communities with other children who shared their struggles. For some, the streets of London became a kind of family. Children would band together, looking out for each other as they navigated the dangers of their world. They found comfort in one another's company, sharing stories, games, and, occasionally, small moments of joy. This video will continue to explore the grim reality of Victorian London's child labor system, highlighting the resilience of the children who endured unimaginable conditions. As we move forward, we'll discuss the reforms that slowly began to take shape in response to the growing awareness of child exploitation. But for now, remember the bravery and determination of the children who worked day in and day out to survive in a world that showed them little compassion. As we continue to explore the harsh realities of child labor during the Victorian era, it's important to acknowledge the growing awareness of the inhumane conditions these children faced. Over time, social reformers, activists, and even some members of the middle and upper classes began to speak out against the abuse and exploitation of children, laying the groundwork for the social reforms that would eventually improve the lives of many. However, these changes were slow, and the road to reform was long and difficult. The Factory Acts, which were introduced in the early 19th century, were some of the first pieces of legislation aimed at regulating the working conditions of children. The Factory Act of 1833 was particularly important in the history of child labor reform. It limited the working hours for children, setting the maximum at 8 hours a day for children aged 9 to 13 and 12 hours a day for those aged 14 to 18. It also required that children receive some form of education during the day. While this act was a step in the right direction, it was by no means a perfect solution. Enforcement of the laws was weak, and many factory owners found ways to circumvent the rules. In some cases, factory inspectors were bribed or simply did not have the resources to enforce the regulations effectively. As a result, many children continue to work long hours in dangerous and unhealthy conditions. One of the key figures in the campaign for reform was Lord Shaftesbury, a prominent social reformer and politician. Shaftesbury was instrumental in pushing for the Factory Acts and other pieces of legislation aimed at improving the lives of children. He was deeply moved by the plight of working children and used his position in Parliament to advocate for their rights. Through his efforts, he brought attention to the abuse of child workers, particularly in the textile industry, where children were forced to work with dangerous machinery for hours on end. Shaftesbury's work was part of a larger social reform movement that gained momentum in the 19th century. The Chartist movement, which called for universal male suffrage and better working conditions for all, also supported the idea that children should not be subjected to long hours of labor. At the same time, religious groups such as the Methodists and Anglicans began to speak out against the exploitation of children, believing that it was a moral obligation to protect the most vulnerable members of society. One of the most powerful influences on child labor reform during the Victorian era was the rise of public awareness. The stories of child workers were brought to light through books, pamphlets, and newspapers, many of which were published by social reformers or people who had witnessed the horrors firsthand. These stories often describe the suffering of children in factories, mines, and other workplaces, and they shocked the public. Charles Dickens, in particular, became one of the most famous voices for children's rights during this period. His novel, Oliver Twist, was a scathing critique of the workhouse system and child labor, and it helped to raise awareness of the dire conditions faced by poor children. Dickens himself had spent part of his childhood working in a boot-blacking factory when his family fell into poverty. His experiences, coupled with his deep empathy for the poor, made him a passionate advocate for social change. Through his work, he sought to expose the systemic abuses that children were subjected to and bring about public outrage. His portrayal of the hardships faced by poor children like Oliver Twist resonated with many readers, and it helped to create a public demand for reform. Another key figure in the reform movement was Dr. Richard Peters, a physician who worked with poor children in London's slums. Peters used his medical expertise to document the effects of child labor on children's health. He published reports on the widespread diseases and injuries that children suffered in factories, and his work helped to demonstrate the physical toll that child labor took on their bodies. His research was crucial in convincing lawmakers and the public that child labor needed to be regulated more strictly. The Factory Act of 1844 was another important piece of legislation aimed at improving the lives of working children. This act raised the minimum age for factory workers to 8 years old and limited the hours that children could work. The law also mandated that children between the ages of 8 and 13 could only work for 6 hours a day. The act was seen as a major victory for child labor reformers, but it still did not go far enough in protecting children from exploitation. Many children continued to work long hours in unhealthy conditions, and the law was not always enforced properly. By the 1850s, reformers were beginning to push for even stronger laws to protect children. The Factory Act of 1856 sought to address some of the gaps in previous legislation, including establishing stricter regulations for the working conditions of children. It also required that factory owners provide basic schooling for children, although the quality of this education was often poor. The Education Act of 1870, which established compulsory education for children, was another milestone in the fight for children's rights. This act made it illegal for children under the age of 10 to work full-time without attending school. Despite the progress made through these reforms, the reality for many children in Victorian London remained grim. While the Factory Acts and education laws began to limit the hours that children could work, the need for cheap labor continued to exist. Many poor children were still forced to work in other sectors, such as coal mines, chimney sweeping, and domestic service. The government, while making some strides in addressing the issue, was often slow to respond to the realities of child exploitation. For many, the workhouse system remained a harsh and unforgiving institution, where children were subjected to long hours of labor, harsh discipline, and overcrowded conditions. However, even in the face of these challenges, the efforts of social reformers continued to build momentum. The Public Health Act of 1875 sought to improve living conditions in the slums, addressing issues like sanitation, overcrowding, and disease. This law, along with the housing reforms of the late 19th century, helped to improve the overall quality of life for the working poor, though much work remained to be done. As the century drew to a close, the reform movement had made significant strides in improving the lives of children. The Children's Charter of 1908, which was passed in response to the growing concerns over child welfare, marked the beginning of a more comprehensive approach to child protection. This law established the juvenile courts and gave the state the power to intervene in cases of neglect and abuse. Though it took decades for the full impact of these laws to be felt, the reforms of the Victorian era set the stage for the modern child protection system that we know today. In the end, the Victorian reforms did not completely eradicate the exploitation of children, but they laid the groundwork for the progress that would follow. The tireless efforts of reformers, social activists, and writers like Dickens brought the issue of child labor into the public consciousness and created a foundation for change. Though the path to reform was long and difficult, the resilience of those who fought for the rights of children ensured that their voices were heard, leading to better laws, protections, and opportunities for future generations. As the Victorian era gave way to the 20th century, the reforms that had been slowly taking shape began to have a more lasting impact on the lives of poor children in London and beyond. The Factory Acts, the rise of public education, and the gradual improvements in living conditions had laid the groundwork for a future where children's rights were better protected. However, while these changes were significant, the road to full protection and opportunity for every child was far from smooth. The early efforts of reformers set the stage for the continuing struggle for children's welfare, but it would take decades for these reforms to be fully realized. One of the most lasting changes to come out of the Victorian reform movements was the expansion of education. The Education Act of 1870, which had made education for children up to the age of 13 compulsory, was a landmark piece of legislation, but its effects were not fully felt until the early 20th century. The law had established the framework for universal education, but it was still up to local authorities to implement it, and many poor children continued to receive inadequate schooling. The quality of education varied greatly depending on where children lived, and many working-class children were still required to work in factories, mines, or on the streets. However, as the century progressed, more and more children began to attend school. The Education Act of 1918, also known as the Fisher Act, further expanded on the work of its predecessors by increasing the school-leaving age to 14 and improving the curriculum for working-class children. This shift allowed more children, especially those from poorer families, to receive a better education, paving the way for greater opportunities later in life. Children were no longer expected to contribute to the family income at such an early age, and many began to move away from factory labor and towards skilled work and trades that required an education. At the same time, the early 20th century saw the establishment of more comprehensive child welfare programs. The Children's Charter of 1908, which had created juvenile courts and reinforced the idea that children were not miniature adults but individuals with special needs, was expanded in the early 1900s. The Children's Act of 1948 further solidified the role of social workers and the state in protecting children from neglect, abuse, and exploitation. This was a major milestone in child protection law, but it was rooted in the efforts of Victorian reformers who had worked to raise awareness about the need for child welfare laws. The rise of the welfare state in the aftermath of the Second World War had a profound effect on children's lives. The creation of the National Health Service, NHS, in 1948 ensured that all children, regardless of their family's financial status, had access to free health care. Before this, poor children were often left untreated for sicknesses and diseases, with many dying from preventable causes. The introduction of vaccinations and better hygiene standards, alongside improved medical care, led to a dramatic reduction in child mortality. This was a direct result of the earlier reforms, which had highlighted the extreme vulnerability of children and pushed for societal change. By the time the 1960s and 1970s rolled around, the social safety nets created in the Victorian era were deeply entrenched. Laws concerning child labor had largely eradicated the practice in most industries, and the overwhelming focus shifted toward children's rights. The United Nations adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, in 1989, was an international recognition of the progress made in child welfare. The CRC outlined the basic rights of children worldwide, including the right to education, protection from abuse, and participation in decisions that affect their lives. Though the Victorian reforms had been national in scope, the CRC set a global standard for children's protection that influenced laws and policies across the world. The foundation laid by the Victorian reformers also influenced the rise of social movements in the 20th century. As industrialization continued, the plight of the poor, especially children, remained at the forefront of many political debates. Movements advocating for workers' rights, equal education, and equal access to health care drew upon the work of earlier reformers who had fought for children's rights. While child labor had been officially abolished in most industries, exploitation continued in other forms, such as child trafficking and the use of children in war. These new forms of exploitation led to the development of international human rights frameworks that focused specifically on the welfare of children, continuing the fight for equality and justice that began in the Victorian era. The reformers of the Victorian era were also the pioneers of the idea that poverty and social inequality were factors that contributed to the exploitation of children. The education reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries helped to break the cycle of poverty by giving children the tools they needed to lift themselves out of it. But even as education became more accessible, the issue of poverty remained a serious problem. Families who lived in slums or had low-paying jobs continued to struggle, and their children were often the ones who paid the price. These children were still vulnerable to exploitation, even as society attempted to improve their working conditions. In the mid-20th century, there were more calls for the eradication of poverty and for the government to take a more active role in supporting poor families. Welfare programs, such as unemployment benefits, housing support, and child allowances, were introduced to assist families who were struggling to make ends meet. These programs helped reduce the burden on children, enabling them to attend school instead of working to support their families. However, the cycle of poverty is persistent, and many children still face challenges that hindered their opportunities. As we entered the 21st century, the legacy of the Victorian reformers continued to shape the policies and systems that protect children today. Though child labor has largely been eradicated in the developed world, children in developing countries still face exploitation, particularly in sweatshops, mines, and conflict zones. However, the lessons learned from the struggles of poor Victorian children and the reforms that followed continue to inspire advocates and policymakers around the globe. The battle for children's rights, however, is far from over. While the Victorian era's reforms created the foundation for the modern child protection system, the fight for equality continues. Children around the world still face significant obstacles, from poverty and violence to lack of education and health care. But as the Victorian reformers showed, change is possible, and the resilience of children continues to be a driving force for progress. Their fight for justice has sparked a global movement that advocates for every child to have the chance to grow, learn, and succeed. As the Victorian era gave way to the 20th century, the reforms that had been slowly taking shape began to have a more lasting impact on the lives of poor children in London and beyond. The Factory Acts, the rise of public education, and the gradual improvements in living conditions had laid the groundwork for a future where children's rights were better protected. However, while these changes were significant, the road to full protection and opportunity for every child was far from smooth. The early efforts of reformers set the stage for the continuing struggle for children's welfare, but it would take decades for these reforms to be fully realized. One of the most lasting changes to come out of the Victorian reform movements was the expansion of education. The Education Act of 1870, which had made education for children up to the age of 13 compulsory, was a landmark piece of legislation, but its effects were not fully felt until the early 20th century. The law had established the framework for universal education, but it was still up to local authorities to implement it, and many poor children continued to receive inadequate schooling. The quality of education varied greatly depending on where children lived, and many working-class children were still required to work in factories, mines, or on the streets. However, as the century progressed, more and more children began to attend school. The Education Act of 1918, also known as the Fisher Act, further expanded on the work of its predecessors by increasing the school-leaving age to 14 and improving the curriculum for working-class children. This shift allowed more children, especially those from poorer families, to receive a better education, paving the way for greater opportunities later in life. Children were no longer expected to contribute to the family income at such an early age, and many began to move away from factory labor and towards skilled work and trades that required an education. At the same time, the early 20th century saw the establishment of more comprehensive child welfare programs. The Children's Charter of 1908, which had created juvenile courts and reinforced the idea that children were not miniature adults but individuals with special needs, was expanded in the early 1900s. The Children's Act of 1948 further solidified the role of social workers and the state in protecting children from neglect, abuse, and exploitation. This was a major milestone in child protection law, but it was rooted in the efforts of Victorian reformers who had worked to raise awareness about the need for child welfare laws. The rise of the welfare state in the aftermath of the Second World War had a profound effect on children's lives. The creation of the National Health Service, NHS, in 1948 ensured that all children, regardless of their family's financial status, had access to free healthcare. Before this, poor children were often left untreated for sicknesses and diseases, with many dying from preventable causes. The introduction of vaccinations and better hygiene standards, alongside improved medical care, led to a dramatic reduction in child mortality. This was a direct result of the earlier reforms, which had highlighted the extreme vulnerability of children and pushed for societal change. By the time the 1960s and 1970s rolled around, the social safety nets created in the Victorian era were deeply entrenched. Laws concerning child labor had largely eradicated the practice in most industries, and the overwhelming focus shifted toward children's rights. The United Nations adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, in 1989 was an international recognition of the progress made in child welfare. The CRC outlined the basic rights of children worldwide, including the right to education, protection from abuse, and participation in decisions that affect their lives. Though the Victorian reforms had been national in scope, the CRC set a global standard for children's protection that influenced laws and policies across the world. The foundation laid by the Victorian reformers also influenced the rise of social movements in the 20th century. As industrialization continued, the plight of the poor, especially children, remained at the forefront of many political debates. Movements advocating for workers' rights, equal education, and equal access to health care drew upon the work of earlier reformers who had fought for children's rights. While child labor had been officially abolished in most industries, exploitation continued in other forms, such as child trafficking and the use of children in war. These new forms of exploitation led to the development of international human rights frameworks that focused specifically on the welfare of children, continuing the fight for equality and justice that began in the Victorian era. The reformers of the Victorian era were also the pioneers of the idea that poverty and social inequality were factors that contributed to the exploitation of children. The education reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries helped to break the cycle of poverty by giving children the tools they needed to lift themselves out of it. But even as education became more accessible, the issue of poverty remained a serious problem. Families who lived in slums or had low-paying jobs continued to struggle, and their children were often the ones who paid the price. These children were still vulnerable to exploitation, even as society attempted to improve their working conditions. In the mid-20th century, there were more calls for the eradication of poverty, and for the government to take a more active role in supporting poor families. Welfare programs, such as unemployment benefits, housing support, and child allowances, were introduced to assist families who were struggling to make ends meet. These programs helped reduce the burden on children, enabling them to attend school instead of working to support their families. However, the cycle of poverty is persistent, and many children still face challenges that hindered their opportunities. As we entered the 21st century, the legacy of the Victorian reformers continued to shape the policies and systems that protect children today. Though child labor has largely been eradicated in the developed world, children in developing countries still face exploitation, particularly in sweatshops, mines, and conflict zones. However, the lessons learned from the struggles of poor Victorian children and the reforms that followed continue to inspire advocates and policymakers around the globe. The battle for children's rights, however, is far from over. While the Victorian era's reforms created the foundation for the modern child protection system, the fight for equality continues. Children around the world still face significant obstacles, from poverty and violence to lack of education and healthcare. But as the Victorian reformers showed, change is possible, and the resilience of children continues to be a driving force for progress. Their fight for justice has sparked a global movement that advocates for every child to have the chance to grow, learn, and succeed. As we look toward the future of child protection, it's clear that the legacy of Victorian-era reforms has paved the way for significant progress in child welfare. However, despite the advancements, there are still many challenges to overcome. The work of Victorian reformers, who fought for the rights of children, has created the foundation for the modern child protection system. But these systems must continue to evolve to address the complex issues facing children today. In the 21st century, the landscape of child exploitation has changed significantly from the days of factory work and chimney sweeping. However, new forms of exploitation have emerged, particularly in response to the globalized economy and the digital revolution. While child labor remains a serious issue in parts of the world, children are increasingly being exploited in other ways, such as child trafficking, online abuse, and child soldiers. These issues present unique challenges that the current child protection system must address in innovative ways. One of the most pressing challenges in the fight for children's rights is the continued existence of child labor in many parts of the world. Despite significant progress in eliminating child labor in industrialized nations, it remains widespread in developing countries, particularly in sectors like agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. Children working in these industries often face dangerous working conditions, exploitation, and abuse. The International Labor Organization, ILO, has estimated that nearly 152 million children are still engaged in child labor worldwide, with the vast majority working in agriculture. Many of these children are exposed to toxic chemicals, dangerous machinery, and physical abuse from employers. To address this issue, global cooperation is essential. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, include a target to eradicate child labor by 2025. However, achieving this goal requires stronger enforcement of existing laws and the introduction of more comprehensive protections for children. Governments, international organizations, and businesses must work together to ensure that supply chains are free from child labor and that alternative education opportunities are provided to children who might otherwise be forced into work. Companies can play a critical role by ensuring that they do not source products from regions where child labor is prevalent, and by taking responsibility for ensuring that their business practices do not contribute to exploitation. Another growing challenge for child protection is the digital age, which has created new avenues for exploitation and abuse. The rise of social media, online gaming, and digital communication has brought about new forms of online grooming, cyberbullying, and sexual exploitation. Children, especially those in vulnerable situations, are increasingly exposed to risks in the online world. Online predators can exploit social media platforms, chat rooms, and gaming apps to groom children for sexual exploitation or trafficking. The digital divide also plays a role in this challenge. While access to technology can be a powerful tool for learning and development, it can also expose children to harmful content and individuals. In many parts of the world, children may be unaware of the dangers posed by the internet, leaving them vulnerable to online predators. Governments and tech companies must work together to create safer online environments for children, implementing stricter regulations on social media platforms and online games. Additionally, digital literacy programs must be expanded to ensure that children are educated about the potential risks of the online world and how to protect themselves. To protect children in the digital age, national governments must enforce stricter cybersecurity laws, regulate online platforms, and implement programs to raise awareness of the dangers of online exploitation. Many countries are already taking steps in this direction. For example, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, includes provisions to protect children's personal data, and the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPA, in the United States, aims to protect children under the age of 13 from online exploitation. However, these laws must be updated regularly to keep pace with the rapid evolution of technology. Furthermore, the problem of child soldiers continues to plague many parts of the world. Armed conflicts in countries like Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, and the Central African Republic have led to the recruitment and use of children as soldiers, often by force or coercion. These children are subjected to extreme violence, abuse, and trauma, and many are left scarred for life. The use of child soldiers violates international law, and the United Nations has repeatedly called for stronger action to end the practice. While progress has been made in some regions, particularly through the demobilization programs that aim to reintegrate former child soldiers back into society, the problem remains widespread. International organizations like Save the Children and Amnesty International have advocated for stronger peacekeeping efforts and for accountability for those who recruit and use child soldiers. As a global community, we must continue to pressure governments to end the practice of child soldier recruitment and provide recovery and reintegration programs for children who have been forced into armed conflict. One of the key lessons learned from the past is that education is one of the most effective tools for protecting children and breaking the cycle of exploitation. Access to education not only empowers children to escape the clutches of poverty and labor, but also provides them with the knowledge and skills to protect themselves from exploitation. In many parts of the world, children are still denied access to education, particularly girls, who are often kept out of school due to cultural norms, poverty, or early marriage. The global education movement has made strides in addressing these disparities. The UNESCO Education for Sustainable Development and the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, are two key organizations working to ensure that every child has access to quality education. However, much more needs to be done to ensure that children in conflict zones, refugee camps, and marginalized communities are not left behind. In addition to providing basic education, governments must focus on improving the quality of education. Many children in developing countries are enrolled in school but receive inadequate instruction due to overcrowded classrooms, underpaid teachers, and outdated curricula. By investing in the training of teachers, ensuring access to learning materials, and expanding access to technology, we can ensure that children are given the tools they need to succeed and protect themselves from exploitation. Another essential component of child protection is the establishment of robust social safety nets. The welfare state, which emerged in the mid-20th century, has provided crucial support for vulnerable children and families. Programs such as child allowances, health care, and subsidized housing help reduce the economic pressures on families, ensuring that children are not forced into labor to survive. Governments must continue to invest in these programs and ensure that they reach the most vulnerable children. Lastly, the role of community-based organizations and local activism cannot be overstated. While international treaties and national laws are important, the grassroots movements that emerge within communities are often the most effective in driving change. Local organizations can provide direct support to children at risk, offer education and training, and advocate for changes in policy at the national level. In conclusion, while the Victorian era's reforms laid the groundwork for modern child protection systems, there is still much to be done. The challenges of child labor, online exploitation, child soldiers, and lack of access to education continue to affect millions of children around the world. However, the efforts of global organizations, governments, and individuals committed to protecting children's rights are beginning to make a difference. By continuing the work that began with the reformers of the Victorian era, we can create a world where all children are free from exploitation, where they have access to quality education, and where their rights are protected and respected. As we continue our journey through the history of child welfare, it's crucial to reflect on the long-term impact of the reforms initiated during the Victorian era and how they have shaped modern society's view of children. The transformation from a time when children were treated as laborers or property to a time when they are recognized as individuals with rights has been one of the most profound shifts in social and legal systems worldwide. While the road to achieving children's rights has been long and full of challenges, the lasting effects of the Victorian child labor reforms continue to resonate in the laws and policies that protect children today. At the heart of this transformation is the recognition that children are not miniature adults. They are individuals with unique needs, vulnerabilities, and the right to grow and develop in a safe and supportive environment. Over the past century, societal attitudes toward children have evolved significantly, largely thanks to the tireless work of reformers in the Victorian era and the subsequent child welfare movements. This shift in perspective has had profound effects on how children are treated, both legally and socially. One of the most notable long-term effects of Victorian reforms is the widespread acceptance of children's rights. During the Victorian era, children were primarily seen as workers or property that contributed to the household economy. They were often viewed through a utilitarian lens, with little regard for their emotional, physical, or educational needs. This mindset began to shift thanks to the work of reformers like Charles Dickens, Lord Shaftesbury, and Dr. Shory Norris. Richard Peters, who recognized that children were not merely tools to be used for labor, but were individuals who deserved care, protection, and education. The establishment of laws, such as the Factory Acts, Education Acts, and the Children's Charter, marked the beginning of a shift toward recognizing the inherent rights of children. By the time we entered the 20th century, these reforms were increasingly codified into national and international laws that defined children as individuals with rights to education, health care, protection from exploitation, and participation in society. The United Nations played a key role in expanding this recognition globally. In 1959, the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child established 10 principles designed to ensure the well-being of children around the world. These principles emphasized the importance of education, protection from abuse, and the right to play and grow in a safe environment. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, adopted in 1989, further expanded these principles, laying out comprehensive rights for children to live in dignity, freedom, and equality. With almost every country in the world ratifying the CRC, this treaty became the cornerstone of modern child protection and children's rights advocacy. As societal views on children shifted, so too did the legal landscape. One of the most significant changes was the shift from viewing children as property to recognizing them as individuals with rights. In the Victorian era, children were often treated as chattel, to be worked or disciplined as their parents saw fit. Today, children are seen as individuals who must be protected and nurtured in order to reach their full potential. This change has been reflected in laws that place the best interests of the child as the paramount consideration in decisions affecting them. The establishment of juvenile courts, child protection services, and education systems have all been integral in shaping the modern conception of childhood as a time of development and growth, not just survival. The impact of these reforms can be seen in the growth of child protection systems. Child welfare organizations and governmental agencies are now dedicated to ensuring that children are protected from abuse, neglect, exploitation, and violence. These systems are designed to intervene when children are at risk and to provide support and care for those who need it. Social workers, child advocacy groups, and law enforcement agencies play an essential role in this system, working together to protect children and hold accountable those who violate their rights. Additionally, these changes have led to significant improvements in access to education for children worldwide. The Victorian reforms, such as the Education Acts, set the stage for the global recognition of education as a fundamental right. Today, education is not just a privilege for the wealthy, but a right for every child, regardless of their socioeconomic background. The development of compulsory education laws in many countries has drastically increased literacy rates and provided opportunities for children to escape the cycle of poverty and exploitation that defined the Victorian era. However, even with these significant achievements, there are still numerous challenges in ensuring that all children have equal access to education and protection. Despite global laws and international treaties, children in many parts of the world still face poverty, exploitation, and violence. According to the UNICEF, nearly 260 million children worldwide are still out of school, and child labor continues to be a significant issue in many developing countries. The persistence of child trafficking, child marriage, and the use of child soldiers also remains a deeply troubling issue. For instance, in regions where conflict is rampant, children are often recruited by armed groups and forced to fight as soldiers. The impact of this exploitation is devastating, with children subjected to violence, trauma, and often death. International organizations, such as the UNICEF, Save the Children, and Amnesty International, continue to advocate for stronger protections for these children and work to demobilize child soldiers and reintegrate them into society. The legacy of the Victorian-era child labor reform movements, which laid the groundwork for child protection laws, continues to fuel these global efforts. Another challenge remains the digital exploitation of children in the age of the internet. With the rapid growth of the digital world, children are increasingly vulnerable to online grooming, cyberbullying, and sexual exploitation. Many children, especially those in vulnerable situations, are at risk of being preyed upon by online predators. The rise of social media platforms, online gaming, and interactive content has introduced new challenges for child protection, requiring governments and technology companies to collaborate on creating safer online environments. Cybersecurity laws and digital literacy programs are essential tools in the fight to protect children in the digital world. However, despite these challenges, The progress made over the past century is undeniable. The Victorian-era reforms sparked a worldwide movement for children's rights that has created systems of protection, support, and opportunity for children in many parts of the world. These reforms have helped to create a society where children are no longer seen as mere laborers or property, but as individuals who have the right to protection, care, education, and a future. The work of those early reformers has shaped modern child protection systems, and the fight for children's rights continues to inspire change today. In conclusion, while much progress has been made since the Victorian era, the fight for children's rights is far from over. Children today still face many of the same challenges their Victorian counterparts did: poverty, exploitation, abuse, and lack of education. However, the legacy of the Victorian-era reforms and the global recognition of children's rights provide a strong foundation for continued progress. Governments, NGOs, advocacy groups, and communities must continue to work together to protect and support children, ensuring that the promise of a better future, free from exploitation and abuse, becomes a reality for every child in the world. Through the Victorian reforms, the challenges that children face today are not entirely different from those endured by their historical counterparts. Children in different parts of the world continue to grapple with poverty, exploitation, lack of education, and abuse. However, global initiatives, modern child protection systems, and international collaborations continue to work tirelessly toward improving the lives of the most vulnerable children. One of the most important developments in global child welfare has been the rise of international collaboration. The United Nations, UN, UNICEF, and a host of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are at the forefront of efforts to protect children worldwide. These organizations not only provide direct aid to children in need, but also serve as powerful advocates for policy changes and the implementation of international child welfare standards. UNICEF and Global Child Protection, one of the most impactful international organizations working to protect children's rights, is UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. Since its founding in 1946, UNICEF has been a central player in improving child health, education, nutrition, and protection worldwide. UNICEF's work spans across continents, tackling issues ranging from malnutrition and disease prevention to child labor and child marriage. In particular, UNICEF's Global Child Protection Program has been instrumental in addressing the widespread issue of child exploitation. They focus on eliminating the worst forms of child labor, protecting children from trafficking, and ensuring that every child can grow up in a safe and nurturing environment. UNICEF's advocacy for education has helped bring attention to the fact that access to education is not just a privilege for wealthy children, but a fundamental human right for all children, especially those in conflict zones or underprivileged regions. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, which was adopted by the UN in 1989, forms the foundation of UNICEF's mission. The CRC ensures that every child is entitled to the protection of their basic rights, including the right to education, healthcare, protection from violence and exploitation, and participation in decisions that affect their lives. The CRC has been ratified by almost every country, providing a powerful, binding legal framework for child protection. Despite this success, UNICEF's work remains crucial as challenges persist in areas such as child labor, violence against children, child trafficking, and the lack of quality education for millions of children, especially girls. UNICEF continues to provide emergency relief in regions affected by natural disasters, armed conflict, and refugee crises, as well as advocating for policies that prioritize child welfare and human rights. Modern legal protections and global initiatives. In addition to the work of UNICEF and similar organizations, national governments have increasingly recognized the importance of legal protections for children. The establishment of child protection laws and the creation of systems for juvenile justice have been instrumental in ensuring that children are treated with the care and respect they deserve. Today, many countries have child protection agencies dedicated to investigating cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. One of the key developments in modern child welfare law has been the establishment of juvenile justice systems that treat children as individuals with distinct needs. These systems are designed to provide rehabilitation and education rather than punishment, acknowledging that children are still developing both mentally and emotionally. Juvenile justice systems also aim to divert young offenders from the criminal justice system and provide support services, such as counseling and education, to help children reintegrate into society. However, these systems still face significant challenges. Poverty, discrimination, and lack of access to quality education continue to feed the cycle of youth incarceration. While many juvenile systems are designed to help children, disparities in resources, lack of consistency, and bias in the justice system often result in children from marginalized communities being disproportionately affected. In the 21st century, international organizations like the World Bank, UNICEF, and the International Labor Organization, ILO, have worked with governments to improve child labor laws globally. The ILO Convention number 182, which focuses on the worst forms of child labor, including slavery, trafficking, and child soldier recruitment, has played a critical role in driving efforts to eliminate harmful child labor. However, despite these laws, global supply chains in industries such as textiles, mining, and agriculture often continue to exploit children, particularly in developing countries. Child rights in the digital age. The rise of digital technology has created both new opportunities and new dangers for children. The internet and social media have opened up global communication and educational opportunities, but have also created significant risks for children's safety. Cyberbullying, online exploitation, grooming, and access to harmful content are just a few of the issues that children face in the digital world. The digital age has introduced complex challenges for child protection, as online predators can exploit children through social media platforms, online gaming, and even streaming services. Governments and tech companies have started to respond to these new challenges, with laws aimed at creating safer digital environments for children. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in the European Union includes provisions to protect children's personal data, while the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, in the United States restricts how companies can collect and use data from children under the age of 13. Additionally, the rise of digital literacy programs has become a key tool in educating children and parents about the risks of the internet and how to navigate online spaces safely. However, challenges remain in ensuring that children in low-resource areas have access to the tools and knowledge they need to protect themselves from online risks. As technology evolves rapidly, it is essential that laws and regulations adapt to the changing landscape of digital threats. Challenges in addressing child marriage and gender inequality. Child marriage remains a significant issue worldwide, with millions of girls being married off before they reach the age of 18. In many countries, particularly in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, cultural norms, poverty, and lack of education perpetuate the practice of child marriage. This practice denies girls the right to an education, subjects them to domestic violence, and severely limits their opportunities for future growth. The global community, through organizations like UNICEF and Girls Not Brides, has made strides in raising awareness and advocating for laws that prohibit child marriage. However, the practice remains prevalent in many countries, especially in rural and marginalized communities. The fight against child marriage requires not only laws and policies, but also cultural change, as communities must be educated about the dangers of early marriage and the importance of empowering girls through education and economic opportunity. The role of NGOs and grassroots movements. While international organizations and governments play a critical role in protecting children, grassroots movements and local NGOs are often the unsung heroes of the child welfare movement. Local child advocacy groups work tirelessly on the ground to provide resources, raise awareness, and advocate for policy changes at the community level. They often work directly with children who are at risk and provide them with the support they need to survive and thrive. These organizations also play an essential role in monitoring child protection issues, holding governments accountable, and filling the gaps left by larger institutions. The global movement for children's rights is a collective effort. Everyone, from policymakers to community leaders to individuals, has a role to play in ensuring that every child's rights are respected and protected. The fight for children's rights is a continuing battle that requires constant vigilance, advocacy, and collaboration across borders. In conclusion, the modern world faces many challenges in ensuring the protection and rights of children. While the Victorian-era reforms laid the foundation for the progress we have made, the issues children face today are complex and evolving. As we move forward, it is essential to continue building on these early reforms, ensuring that children everywhere have the opportunity to grow, learn, and live in a safe, equitable, and nurturing environment. The work of the past and the progress of the present must continue to inspire us to fight for the rights of every child, because the future belongs to them. As we reach the final part of our journey through the history of child welfare, it's crucial to focus on how child protection and children's rights advocacy must evolve in response to the challenges of the modern world. The progress that has been made over the past centuries, from the Victorian reforms to the global conventions and modern protections we have today, serves as a strong foundation. However, as the world continues to change, so too must our efforts to ensure that every child's rights are respected and upheld. In the 21st century, we face an entirely new set of challenges: globalization, the digital revolution, and climate change, all present unique threats to children's well-being. Despite the efforts of UNICEF, NGOs, and governments to protect children, many still face exploitation, violence, and neglect. Child labor, child trafficking, early marriage, sexual exploitation, and digital abuse are all pressing issues that require urgent attention. So what can we do to continue advocating for children's rights and creating a world where every child is safe, protected, and able to reach their full potential? Advocacy through education, the power of awareness. One of the most powerful tools in advancing child welfare is education. Just as Victorian reformers used literature, reports, and media to raise awareness about the plight of children, today's advocates can leverage digital platforms, social media, and public campaigns to continue spreading the message of children's rights. Public awareness is crucial in the fight against child labor, child trafficking, and abuse, as it often leads to community action and government intervention. The power of education cannot be overstated. Children, parents, and communities must understand the importance of children's rights and the resources available to protect them. Education programs aimed at both adults and children can teach self-protection, digital literacy, and the dangers of child exploitation. Governments and NGOs need to expand these programs, especially in underdeveloped or marginalized regions, where children are particularly vulnerable. Digital literacy programs are especially important in today's digital age, where children are exposed to online abuse and grooming. As the internet becomes more integrated into children's daily lives, it is crucial that children are educated about how to protect themselves online and recognize online dangers. Empowering children with knowledge about privacy, safe communication, and how to report abuse is an essential step in preventing online exploitation. Legal reforms and strengthening protection laws. While education plays a crucial role, legal reforms are at the heart of creating lasting change for children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, has provided a global framework for child protection, but there is still much work to be done to ensure that its provisions are fully implemented. Countries that have ratified the CRC must continue to strengthen and enforce child protection laws, ensuring that they adequately address the evolving risks children face today. One area that requires continued attention is child labor. Despite international laws and agreements like ILO Convention number 182 and the CRC, child labor is still widespread, particularly in developing countries. The global supply chain has often been complicit in perpetuating exploitative child labor, particularly in industries such as mining, agriculture, and textile manufacturing. Governments must take stronger action to regulate industries and hold businesses accountable for ensuring that their operations do not exploit children. Similarly, child trafficking and sexual exploitation continue to be pervasive problems. Despite legal frameworks like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States and similar laws around the world, traffickers still find ways to exploit vulnerable children for forced labor, sexual exploitation, and child prostitution. International collaboration between governments, law enforcement, and NGOs is essential in combating trafficking networks and ensuring that those who exploit children are held accountable. The establishment of family courts, juvenile justice systems, and child welfare agencies over the last century has been a major milestone in protecting children. These systems must continue to evolve to meet the needs of children in the digital age, providing comprehensive services to those who face abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Additionally, these systems should be accessible and effective in marginalized communities where children are at greatest risk. Tackling poverty and gender inequality, another critical aspect of protecting children, is addressing poverty and gender inequality, which continue to undermine children's rights across the globe. Children who grow up in poverty are more likely to suffer from malnutrition, lack of education, and exploitation. Poverty forces many children into child labor, early marriage, and dangerous work environments simply to survive. The eradication of child poverty is a global challenge, but it is one that can be tackled through coordinated efforts. Social welfare programs, including child allowances, universal health care, and subsidized housing, must be expanded to ensure that all families, especially those in poverty, can meet their children's needs. Governments must work to provide economic opportunities for families, ensuring that parents have access to decent jobs and livable wages so that their children can be freed from the cycle of exploitation. Gender inequality also continues to be a major barrier to children's rights. Girls, in particular, are disproportionately affected by child marriage, sexual exploitation, and lack of education. In many parts of the world, girls are denied the opportunity to go to school and are married off at a young age, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and discrimination. Addressing gender inequality requires both legislative change and cultural transformation. Governments, international organizations, and local communities must work together to empower girls, ensure they have access to education, and protect them from harmful cultural practices. Strengthening global partnerships and advocacy. The fight for children's rights is a global effort, and international collaboration remains essential to creating a world where every child is protected and empowered. Partnerships between governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and businesses are critical in ensuring that the needs of children are met. International initiatives like the Global Partnership for Education and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are examples of efforts to ensure that education and child welfare are at the center of global development. One of the key strategies for advancing children's rights is advocacy. Organizations like Save the Children, World Vision, and Plan International continue to advocate for policy changes at the local, national, and international levels. Through public campaigns, lobbying efforts, and awareness-raising activities, these organizations bring attention to the issues that matter most to children and push for meaningful change. In the future, digital advocacy will become increasingly important. The rise of social media, crowdfunding, and digital platforms provides new opportunities for child welfare advocates to reach a global audience and mobilize action. Youth-led movements can also play an important role in advancing children's rights, as the next generation of leaders becomes increasingly active in advocating for the issues that affect them and their peers. The role of the individual. How you can make a difference. While international organizations and governments have an essential role to play in the fight for children's rights, individual actions matter too. Each of us can make a difference in the lives of children by supporting child welfare organizations, raising awareness about children's rights, and advocating for policy changes in our communities. Supporting charities and NGOs that focus on children's rights, volunteering at local shelters, and educating others about the importance of protecting children can all contribute to making a positive impact. Moreover, advocating for children's rights in our daily lives is an important step in creating a world where all children are respected. Whether through raising awareness on social media, speaking out against exploitation, or supporting legislative changes in your community, each small action contributes to a larger movement for change. In conclusion, the fight for children's rights is far from over. The progress made in the past century, beginning with the Victorian reforms, has provided a foundation for the child protection systems we have today. However, new challenges continue to arise in a globalized and digitally connected world. By continuing to advocate for children's rights, strengthening legal protections, addressing poverty and inequality, and collaborating globally, we can create a world where every child is safe, protected, and given the opportunity to thrive. As we reach the final part of our journey through the history of child welfare, it's crucial to focus on how child protection and children's rights advocacy must evolve in response to the challenges of the modern world. The progress that has been made over the past centuries, from the Victorian reforms to the global conventions and modern protections we have today, serves as a strong foundation. However, as the world continues to change, so too must our efforts to ensure that every child's rights are respected and upheld. In the 21st century, we face an entirely new set of challenges. Globalization, the digital revolution, and climate change all present unique threats to children's well-being. Despite the efforts of UNICEF, NGOs, and governments to protect children, many still face exploitation, violence, and neglect. Child labor, child trafficking, early marriage, sexual exploitation, and digital abuse are all pressing issues that require urgent attention. So what can we do to continue advocating for children's rights and creating a world where every child is safe, protected, and able to reach their full potential? Advocacy through education. The power of awareness. One of the most powerful tools in advancing child welfare is education. Just as Victorian reformers used literature, reports, and media to raise awareness about the plight of children, today's advocates can leverage digital platforms, social media, and public campaigns to continue spreading the message of children's rights. Public awareness is crucial in the fight against child labor, child trafficking, and abuse, as it often leads to community action and government intervention. The power of education cannot be overstated. Children, parents, and communities must understand the importance of children's rights and the resources available to protect them. Education programs aimed at both adults and children can teach self-protection, digital literacy, and the dangers of child exploitation. Governments and NGOs need to expand these programs, especially in underdeveloped or marginalized regions where children are particularly vulnerable. Digital literacy programs are especially important in today's digital age, where children are exposed to online abuse and grooming. As the internet becomes more integrated into children's daily lives, it is crucial that children are educated about how to protect themselves online and recognize online dangers. Empowering children with knowledge about privacy, safe communication, and how to report abuse is an essential step in preventing online exploitation. Legal reforms and strengthening protection laws. While education plays a crucial role, legal reforms are at the heart of creating lasting change for children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, has provided a global framework for child protection, but there is still much work to be done to ensure that its provisions are fully implemented. Countries that have ratified the CRC must continue to strengthen and enforce child protection laws, ensuring that they adequately address the evolving risks children face today. One area that requires continued attention is child labor. Despite international laws and agreements like ILO Convention No. 182 and the CRC, child labor is still widespread, particularly in developing countries. The global supply chain has often been complicit in perpetuating exploitive child labor, particularly in industries such as mining, agriculture, and textile manufacturing. Governments must take stronger action to regulate industries and hold businesses accountable for ensuring that their operations do not exploit children. Similarly, child trafficking and sexual exploitation continue to be pervasive problems. Despite legal frameworks like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States and similar laws around the world, traffickers still find ways to exploit vulnerable children for forced labor, sexual exploitation, and child prostitution. International collaboration between governments, law enforcement, and NGOs is essential in combating trafficking networks and ensuring that those who exploit children are held accountable. The establishment of family courts, juvenile justice systems, and child welfare agencies over the last century has been a major milestone in protecting children. These systems must continue to evolve to meet the needs of children in the digital age, providing comprehensive services to those who face abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Additionally, these systems should be accessible and effective in marginalized communities where children are at greatest risk. Tackling poverty and gender inequality. Another critical aspect of protecting children is addressing poverty and gender inequality, which continue to undermine children's rights across the globe. Children who grow up in poverty are more likely to suffer from malnutrition, lack of education, and exploitation. Poverty forces many children into child labor, early marriage, and dangerous work environments simply to survive. The eradication of child poverty is a global challenge, but it is one that can be tackled through coordinated efforts. Social welfare programs, including child allowances, universal health care, and subsidized housing, must be expanded to ensure that all families, especially those in poverty, can meet their children's needs. Governments must work to provide economic opportunities for families, ensuring that parents have access to decent jobs and livable wages, so that their children can be freed from the cycle of exploitation. Gender inequality also continues to be a major barrier to children's rights. Girls, in particular, are disproportionately affected by child marriage, sexual exploitation, and lack of education. In many parts of the world, girls are denied the opportunity to go to school and are married off at a young age, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and discrimination. Addressing gender inequality requires both legislative change and cultural transformation. Governments, international organizations, and local communities must work together to empower girls, ensure they have access to education, and protect them from harmful cultural practices. Strengthening global partnerships and advocacy. The fight for children's rights is a global effort, and international collaboration remains essential to creating a world where every child is protected and empowered. Partnerships between governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and businesses are critical in ensuring that the needs of children are met. International initiatives, like the Global Partnership for Education and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are examples of efforts to ensure that education and child welfare are at the center of global development. One of the key strategies for advancing children's rights is advocacy. Organizations like Save the Children, World Vision, and Plan International continue to advocate for policy changes at the local, national, and international levels. Through public campaigns, lobbying efforts, and awareness-raising activities, these organizations bring attention to the issues that matter most to children and push for meaningful change. In the future, digital advocacy will become increasingly important. The rise of social media, crowdfunding, and digital platforms provides new opportunities for child welfare advocates to reach a global audience and mobilize action. Youth-led movements can also play an important role in advancing children's rights, as the next generation of leaders becomes increasingly active in advocating for the issues that affect them and their peers. The role of the individual, how you can make a difference. While international organizations and governments have an essential role to play in the fight for children's rights, individual actions matter too. Each of us can make a difference in the lives of children by supporting child welfare organizations, raising awareness about children's rights, and advocating for policy changes in our communities. Supporting charities and NGOs that focus on children's rights, volunteering at local shelters, and educating others about the importance of protecting children can all contribute to making a positive impact. Moreover, advocating for children's rights in our daily lives is an important step in creating a world where all children are respected. Whether through raising awareness on social media, speaking out against exploitation, or supporting legislative changes in your community, each small action contributes to a larger movement for change. In conclusion, the fight for children's rights is far from over. The progress made in the past century, beginning with the Victorian reforms, has provided a foundation for the child protection systems we have today. However, new challenges continue to arise in a globalized and digitally connected world. By continuing to advocate for children's rights, strengthening legal protections, addressing poverty and inequality, and collaborating globally, we can create a world where every child is safe, protected, and given the opportunity to thrive. Good night. And may the stories of resilience and advocacy for children inspire you as you rest, knowing that the work continues for a brighter, more just future for every child. Welcome to our channel, where we explore history's darkest, strangest, and most unforgettable chapters. Tonight we begin a long journey into Victorian London, a city of empire and progress on the surface, yet filth, disease, and decay beneath its streets. In this story, you'll discover why the world once called London the dirtiest city on earth, how everyday life unfolded among overflowing sewage, choking smoke, rotting food, and crowded slums, and how millions of ordinary people tried to survive inside a city that was slowly poisoning itself. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and like this video if you enjoy slow, detailed history stories like this one. And tell us in the comments from which location you're watching. It's always fascinating to see where these stories travel across the world. Victorian London was a city of contradictions. It was the heart of the largest empire the world had ever seen, a place of innovation, wealth, railways, factories, and global trade. But for all its power and prosperity, London was also drowning in its own waste. By the mid-19th century, more than 2 million people were packed into a city that had never been designed to handle such numbers. Streets built for horses and carts now carried endless traffic, markets spilled into alleyways, and entire families were crammed into single damp rooms. The city grew faster than sanitation, planning, or common sense could keep up. Cleanliness as we understand it today barely existed for most Londoners. Running water was rare, especially in poor neighborhoods. Toilets were a luxury. Instead, most homes relied on cesspits, deep holes beneath houses that collected human waste. These pits were often never emptied properly. When they overflowed, the filth seeped into walls, floors, and nearby wells. Drinking water frequently came from the same ground contaminated by sewage. People didn't fully understand germs yet, so the connection between waste and disease remained a mystery to many. The streets themselves were another nightmare. London's roads were coated in layers of mud, animal dung, rotting food, and industrial waste. Horses were everywhere, pulling carts, buses, and carriages, and each horse produced large amounts of manure every day. This manure piled up in the streets, mixing with rainwater and turning roads into foul-smelling rivers of filth. In dry weather, the manure dried into dust and filled the air. In wet weather, it became thick sludge that soaked into shoes and clothing. Markets added another layer of decay. Butchers slaughtered animals in open stalls, letting blood run into the streets. Fishmongers dumped spoiled fish where they stood. Vegetable waste, bones, and scraps were often left to rot where they fell. Rats thrived in these conditions, growing bold and numerous. They crawled through homes, markets, and sewers, spreading disease and fear. For many Londoners, rats were as familiar as cats or dogs. The Thames River, once a source of pride, became the city's most disgusting symbol. London used the Thames as its main sewer. Human waste, industrial chemicals, slaughterhouse remains, and garbage were all dumped directly into the river. Water companies still drew drinking water from the Thames, often downstream from sewage outlets. The river became thick, dark, and foul-smelling. Dead animals floated past busy docks. In hot weather, the stench was so overpowering that people covered their noses with cloths soaked in vinegar. Factories worsened everything. The Industrial Revolution brought coal-powered machines, and London burned enormous amounts of coal every day. Thick black smoke poured from chimneys, covering buildings in soot. The air was constantly hazy, and sunlight struggled to break through. This smoke settled on everything: food, clothing, lungs. Breathing in Victorian London meant inhaling a mixture of coal dust, sewage fumes, and industrial pollution. Coughing was common. Lung diseases were widespread. Many people never knew what it felt like to breathe clean air. Housing conditions made the filth impossible to escape. In the poorest districts, entire families lived in single rooms with no ventilation. Garbage was often stored indoors because there was nowhere else to put it. Chamber pots, used as toilets, were emptied into the street or nearby drains. Washing was infrequent, not only because water was scarce, but because heating water required time, fuel, and money. Clothes were worn until they fell apart. Bodies were rarely bathed. The smell of sweat, waste, smoke, and decay clung to people wherever they went. Children grew up surrounded by dirt. They played in streets filled with waste, slept in damp rooms, and drank polluted water. Many never reached adulthood. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery swept through neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Entire families could be wiped out within days. Yet many Victorians believed these illnesses were caused by bad air or miasma, rather than contaminated water. This belief delayed meaningful action and allowed the city's filth to continue unchecked. Even wealth could not fully protect people. While the rich lived in cleaner areas and larger homes, They still traveled through filthy streets and breathed polluted air. Servants carried dirt indoors on their clothes. Food markets supplied spoiled goods. The Thames stench reached Parliament itself. London's filth did not respect class boundaries. It only punished the poor more severely. Despite all this, life went on. People adapted. They held handkerchiefs to their faces, sprinkled lime over waste, and burned incense to mask smells. Newspapers complained endlessly about the filth, but solutions were slow and expensive. City officials argued. Engineers proposed ambitious sewer systems. Politicians delayed action. Meanwhile, London kept growing, and the dirt kept piling up. By the middle of the 19th century, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Visitors from abroad were shocked. Writers and journalists described London as a nightmare of smoke and stench. The phrase, "the dirtiest city in the world," was not an exaggeration. It was a warning. A city that ruled half the globe could not even manage its own waste. And still, beneath the grime and decay, millions of people lived, worked, loved, and dreamed. Shopkeepers opened their stalls each morning. Children laughed in the streets. Workers poured into factories at dawn. Victorian London was filthy, yes, but it was also alive, restless, and unstoppable. In the next part of this story, we'll step deeper into the city's slums, exploring how overcrowding and poverty turned dirt into disaster, and how entire neighborhoods became breeding grounds for disease and despair. In the mid-19th century, as the squalor and filth of Victorian London continued to grow, some individuals and groups began to push back against the prevailing ignorance and neglect of the poor and the city's deteriorating infrastructure. Reform was not quick to come, but over time, the pressures for change grew too strong to ignore. As London's population exploded and the city became synonymous with disease, filth, and despair, a series of health and sanitation reforms began to emerge that would forever alter the city's future. The road to improvement was long and arduous, but it was a beginning that would slowly clean the streets, reduce disease, and transform London from the world's dirtiest city into one of the most advanced cities of the modern era. The turning point came with the outbreak of cholera in the mid-1800s. Cholera, which had been a recurring threat in Europe, became a deadly epidemic in London, killing thousands each time it appeared. The connection between poor sanitation and disease was not immediately understood, but the recurring outbreaks of cholera in the city forced public attention to the city's unsanitary conditions, and the need for reform became undeniable. The man who would eventually revolutionize London's sanitation system was Dr. John Snow, a physician who is often regarded as one of the founding figures of modern epidemiology. In 1854, a massive cholera outbreak occurred in Soho, an area of central London. Dr. Snow, working on the theory that cholera was spread through contaminated water rather than air, meticulously traced the outbreak's source to a public water pump on Broad Street. By analyzing the locations of those who fell ill and conducting a careful investigation, Snow proved that cholera was being transmitted through water, not bad air or miasma. His work led to a critical shift in the understanding of how diseases spread and laid the foundation for modern public health reform. However, even as Dr. Snow made his discoveries, London's sanitation systems remained woefully inadequate. The city's sewer systems were outdated, and most of the waste was either dumped into the streets or directly into the Thames River, the very source of much of the city's drinking water. Raw sewage, mixed with waterborne diseases, created a vicious cycle, where the city's inhabitants became both the victims and unwitting contributors to the pollution. Infectious diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever were rampant. As Dr. Snow's theories gained traction, the urgency for reform grew, but real change would take years. In the same decade that Snow's work was making waves in public health, another figure emerged who would become pivotal in the fight for sanitation reform. Sir Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer whose contributions would reshape the landscape of London itself. Bazalgette was tasked with designing a new sewer system to address the crisis. He recognized that the old sewers, simple open drains that ran along the streets, were not sufficient for a rapidly expanding city. In fact, they were actively contributing to the spread of disease. His plan involved constructing a vast underground system of sewers that would channel waste away from the city and into the Thames, but far enough away from the city's drinking water intake to prevent contamination. Bazalgette's design was a monumental undertaking that would take years to complete. The sewer system, completed in the early 1860s, was a triumph of engineering. It was a system that could carry London's waste away safely, without the need for cesspits or open sewers. The sewers ran for hundreds of miles, and Bazalgette's work became the model for modern urban sanitation systems. The cleaner streets and improved public health were immediate benefits, but the long-term impact of Bazalgette's work cannot be overstated. His sewer system helped to eliminate cholera outbreaks, reduce the spread of disease, and laid the foundation for the urban planning that would follow in other cities across the globe. At the same time, the city began to improve its waste management systems. The introduction of regular garbage collection and more sanitary waste disposal methods reduced the accumulation of refuse on the streets. New laws were passed to regulate the cleaning of public spaces, and many of the poorest areas of London, once mired in filth, began to experience cleaner, healthier conditions. He passed to regulate the cleaning of public spaces, and many of the poorest areas of London, once mired in filth, began to experience cleaner, healthier conditions. In addition to improvements in sanitation, the Victorian era saw the development of a more structured approach to public health. Public health boards were established to monitor the spread of disease and enforce hygiene standards. The city's hospitals grew larger and more equipped to deal with the health crises that had plagued London for so long. These reforms slowly but surely improved life for the poor, who had been disproportionately affected by the city's filth and disease. The work of public health pioneers laid the groundwork for the National Health Service, NHS, which would be established much later in the 20th century. While sanitation was perhaps the most urgent reform, housing conditions for the working poor were also addressed. The Victorian era saw the rise of slum clearances and the building of better housing for those in the worst conditions. Though these efforts were far from perfect, they were an essential part of improving the quality of life for the lower classes. Victorian philanthropists like Octavia Hill and Charles Booth worked to improve housing for the poor, organizing the construction of new model housing that offered better conditions than the overcrowded slums in which so many had lived. These new developments were small steps forward in the fight for social equity, though many poor Londoners still lived in appalling conditions for years to come. Meanwhile, the industrial landscape of London was also undergoing a transformation. As new methods of transportation, like horse-drawn trams and later electric streetcars, became more common, the city's street-level pollution began to lessen. Industrial pollution, though still an issue, began to be managed more effectively with better urban planning and regulations. By the late Victorian period, London had started to shift toward a cleaner, more organized city. But the impact of pollution and overcrowding remained a central issue in public health debates. However, the changes in sanitation and public health were not without their challenges. Social inequality was still deeply entrenched in London, and many of the working poor found it difficult to access the benefits of the reforms. Poor housing and overcrowding remained a significant issue for much of the population, particularly in the East End, where poverty was most concentrated. The gap between the rich and the poor persisted, with the wealthy enjoying the benefits of cleaner streets, better health care, and more secure living conditions, while the poor still struggled to survive in the shadows of the city. But despite these inequalities, the reforms of the mid to late Victorian era marked a turning point in the history of London. The sewer systems, improved waste management, and growing awareness of the importance of sanitation transformed the city into a much cleaner and healthier place. The advancements made in public health and infrastructure would shape the future of cities worldwide. It was not an instantaneous change, nor was it perfect, but Victorian London, with all its grime and disease, gradually transformed into a city that could, in time, become the model for modern urban health and living standards. As the sanitation and public health reforms began to take shape in Victorian London, the city started to experience a transformation, one that reached beyond just cleaner streets and improved infrastructure. These changes began to affect the daily lives of the working class population, whose lives had been most heavily impacted by the city's filth and disease. Yet, while the reforms helped alleviate some of the most immediate threats to public health, they also exposed deeper issues of social inequality, class division, and the struggles of the poor in a rapidly changing world. The improvements in sanitation, such as the construction of Baselget's sewer system and the increased regulation of waste and garbage, provided much-needed relief from the constant threat of disease. The reduction in cholera outbreaks, once a regular and deadly feature of life in London, was a clear sign of progress. However, the social divide between the wealthy and the poor remained stark, and the benefits of these reforms were not always equally shared. While the upper classes in their grand homes were largely insulated from the worst effects of disease and poverty, the working class population still faced many challenges. One of the most profound impacts of the reforms was in the area of housing. The Victorian era was marked by overcrowded slums, particularly in the East End of London, where thousands of working-class families lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Although the introduction of model housing and slum clearance programs by philanthropists like Octavia Hill and Charles Booth improved conditions for some, the vast majority of the poor were still forced to live in overcrowded and poorly constructed homes. These homes were often poorly ventilated, damp, and lacked access to basic sanitation. In fact, even as the sewer systems improved, many homes in the slums had no indoor plumbing, and the idea of a private bathroom was far out of reach for most families. The increased awareness of the importance of sanitation and hygiene brought about by the reforms did little to alleviate the deep-seated class divisions that continued to exist in the city. While wealthier citizens could afford to live in cleaner, better-constructed homes in more affluent areas, the poor were left behind in the slums. Social housing, or public housing that could have served as a safety net for the working poor, was still largely underdeveloped, and the government was slow to address the housing crisis. Those living in the slums continued to face overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and poor living conditions long after the improvements in the city's infrastructure were made. The impact of these social inequalities was felt most acutely by women and children in the working class. As household laborers, women in the working class communities of Victorian London often found themselves performing both paid work in factories or service jobs and unpaid domestic labor at home. The poorest families could not afford to hire servants or buy the necessary tools to run their homes efficiently. Instead, they relied on women and children to take on the bulk of the labor, often working long hours in extremely difficult conditions. Children, particularly, were expected to contribute to the household's income, even if it meant working in dangerous and unhealthy environments like chimney sweeping, factory work, and coal mining. For these children, the reforms that improved the sanitation of the streets and the removal of waste from the city did little to change the physical toll of hard labor. While child labor laws were passed in the late 19th century, limiting the number of hours children could work and banning the employment of children under a certain age, these laws were not always enforced, and many children still worked long hours in factories and mines. Child labor remained a significant issue throughout much of the Victorian era, even as public health and sanitation improved. The Victorian ideal of respectability also perpetuated the social inequality between the classes. The middle and upper classes adhered to a set of moral and social codes that emphasized personal responsibility, hard work, and cleanliness. These values were used to justify the marginalization and punishment of the working poor. The poor were often blamed for their circumstances, with their living conditions deemed a reflection of their laziness or moral failings. The idea of the poor being undeserving of public assistance was prevalent, and the poor were left to fend for themselves, even as the government and the wealthy elite made small strides in improving the public infrastructure. While some reforms did provide basic welfare services, such as the establishment of the National Health Service and public health initiatives, these efforts were not enough to address the root causes of poverty and inequality in Victorian London. Many working-class families were still left with little access to quality education, healthcare, and social mobility. The working poor were often trapped in a cycle of poverty, with few opportunities for improvement. Child labor, poor housing, and lack of access to basic services ensured that many families could not escape the hardships they faced. Despite these challenges, the working class continued to show remarkable resilience and community strength. The growth of trade unions and workers' movements during the Victorian era was one of the most significant social changes of the period. These movements fought for better wages, safer working conditions, and better treatment of workers. The Labour Party emerged as a political force in the late 19th century, advocating for the rights of the working class and pushing for social reforms that would benefit the poor. Through their collective efforts, the working class began to challenge the status quo and fight for better conditions, both in the workplace and in society as a whole. At the same time, the philanthropic efforts of individuals like Octavia Hill, Charles Booth, and George Peabody began to make a difference in the lives of some of the working poor. These reformers advocated for better housing, cleaner streets, and improved living conditions for the poor. They recognized the deep social inequalities that existed in Victorian society and worked to address them through their charitable efforts. While their work was often limited in scope, these individuals helped to lay the groundwork for the modern welfare state that would emerge in the 20th century. Though these reforms marked an important shift in the way that the working poor were viewed by society, much of the victim-blaming mentality persisted. The poor continued to be portrayed as lazy or morally deficient, and their squalid living conditions were often seen as a reflection of their character. While the sanitation reforms and public health measures were important, they could not address the deep-seated inequalities that existed in Victorian society. As we move forward in the story of London's transformation, we will see how the public health revolution gave way to welfare state policies that would better protect the working poor. The struggle for equality and better living conditions would continue well into the 20th century, ultimately changing the way that society and government viewed the welfare of the poor. As the late Victorian era moved toward the end of the 19th century, the changes brought about by sanitation reforms began to ripple outward in ways that few had initially anticipated. What started as an attempt to control disease and filth slowly reshaped how cities were built, governed, and imagined. Victorian London, once overwhelmed by waste and decay, became a living experiment in how human settlements could adapt to industrial growth. The lessons learned in its streets, sewers, and slums would influence not only Britain, but cities around the world. One of the most important long-term effects of Victorian reforms was the birth of modern urban planning. Before this period, cities grew organically, with little thought given to airflow, waste disposal, or population density. Streets twisted unpredictably. Housing was built wherever space allowed, and infrastructure followed as an afterthought, if it appeared at all. The horrors of disease outbreaks forced officials to recognize that cities could no longer be left to grow unchecked. Health, order, and efficiency became matters of public responsibility rather than private concern. Gradually, London began to be reshaped by new ideas. Streets were widened to allow light and air to circulate. Open drains were covered or replaced with underground systems. New housing developments were designed with ventilation in mind, a radical concept at the time. Parks and green spaces were introduced not merely for beauty, but as a response to the understanding that clean air and open land were essential to physical and mental health. These spaces offered working-class families brief escapes from overcrowded neighborhoods and gave children places to play away from filth-filled streets. Public health itself became a recognized field. Medical officers were appointed to monitor neighborhoods, inspect housing, and track outbreaks of disease. Statistics began to matter. Death rates, infant mortality, and life expectancy were carefully recorded and analyzed. For the first time, policymakers could see clear evidence that poor sanitation led directly to illness and death. This data-driven approach transformed how governments responded to crises. Disease was no longer viewed purely as divine punishment or moral failure, but increasingly as a problem that could be measured, managed, and prevented. Education played a crucial role in reinforcing these changes. As schooling became more accessible, children learned basic principles of hygiene that their parents had never been taught. Washing hands, cleaning living spaces, and avoiding contaminated water slowly became common knowledge rather than rare practices. While poverty still limited what families could realistically achieve, awareness alone marked a significant shift. A generation was growing up with a different understanding of health, cleanliness, and responsibility. The city's relationship with the Thames, also began to change. Once treated as an open sewer, the river slowly regained its importance as a managed waterway rather than a dumping ground. New embankments reshaped its banks, controlling flooding and improving transportation routes. Though pollution did not disappear overnight, the idea that a river should be protected rather than abused represented a major change in thinking. Water was no longer infinite or disposable. It was a resource that required stewardship. These developments also altered how governments viewed their role in citizens' lives. Victorian authorities had long resisted intervention, believing that individuals should manage their own welfare. But the scale of London's problems made this stance impossible to maintain. Disease did not respect class boundaries. Smoke drifted into wealthy districts. Epidemics crossed neighborhood lines. Gradually, the belief took hold that public health was a shared responsibility. This shift laid the groundwork for future welfare policies, housing regulations, and environmental laws. However, progress remained uneven. While central areas of London improved, many working-class neighborhoods continued to suffer. Slum clearance projects often displaced families without offering affordable alternatives. Entire communities were uprooted in the name of improvement, pushing the poor farther from employment and support networks. For some, reforms felt less like rescue and more like erasure. The city looked cleaner on the surface, but the struggles of the poor did not vanish. They were simply relocated. Industrial pollution also remained a persistent problem. Coal continued to power factories, trains, and homes. Smoke-darkened skies were still a common sight, and respiratory illnesses remained widespread. Though sanitation reforms addressed waste and water, air pollution lagged behind as a serious concern. Victorians accepted smoke as the price of progress, unaware of the long-term damage it caused to lungs, buildings, and ecosystems. True environmental awareness was still decades away. Yet even with these limitations, Victorian London had changed fundamentally. The idea that cities could and should be designed to support human health became increasingly accepted. Other cities across Britain and Europe studied London's sewer system and adopted similar approaches. What had once been a symbol of failure slowly became a model for reform. Social attitudes evolved as well. The visibility of poverty and disease, once hidden or ignored, became central to public debate. Newspapers published investigations into housing conditions. Writers and reformers continued to expose injustice. Ordinary citizens, armed with better information, began to demand accountability from those in power. The seeds of civic engagement were planted, growing into movements that would shape the 20th century. By the closing decades of the Victorian era, London stood at a crossroads. It was cleaner than it had been, healthier than before, and better organized, but still deeply unequal. The city had proven that filth and disease were not inevitable, yet it had not solved the deeper problem of poverty. Sanitation could remove waste from streets, but it could not erase hunger, overcrowding, or exploitation. Those challenges would require new ideas, new laws, and new ways of thinking about society itself. As the century drew toward its end, London's transformation was incomplete, but irreversible. The worst excesses of filth had been confronted. The connection between environment and health had been established, and the city, once infamous for its stench and sickness, had begun the slow journey toward becoming a modern metropolis. City, once infamous for its stench and sickness, had begun the slow journey toward becoming a modern metropolis. As Victorian London continued its slow transformation, the changes in infrastructure began to seep into the rhythms of everyday life. Cleanliness was no longer just an abstract idea discussed by engineers and politicians. It started to shape how ordinary people moved through the city, how they cared for their homes, and how they understood health and survival. These shifts did not happen overnight, and for many Londoners, especially the poor, they were subtle, uneven, and often frustratingly incomplete. Daily routines began to change first. In neighborhoods where new water pumps and improved drainage were installed, families noticed fewer foul smells and less standing waste in the streets. Washing, once a rare and exhausting task, slowly became more common where water access improved. Public washhouses opened in some districts, allowing working-class families to clean clothes and bodies more regularly. These places were crowded and noisy, but they represented progress, a recognition that cleanliness should not be reserved for the wealthy alone. Markets, too, began to change. New regulations required vendors to dispose of waste properly and avoid selling spoiled food. While enforcement was inconsistent, the very existence of such rules marked a shift in priorities. Food safety, once largely ignored, became a topic of concern. People grew more aware of the connection between what they consumed and how they felt afterward. Though germs were still poorly understood, experience taught harsh lessons, and memory lingered long after outbreaks faded. Children growing up in this transitional period experienced a city different from that of their parents. Streets were still dirty, but not quite as deadly. The constant fear of sudden cholera outbreaks began to ease. Schools, where available, reinforced ideas about hygiene, order, and discipline. For some children, cleanliness became part of moral education. Washing hands, keeping clothes neat, and avoiding filth were framed not only as healthy practices, but as signs of respectability. This blending of hygiene and morality shaped attitudes for generations. Yet, improvement came with tension. Many working-class families viewed new regulations with suspicion. Inspections felt intrusive. Orders to clean homes or move out of condemned buildings were often issued without offering alternatives. For people already living on the edge of survival, reform sometimes felt like punishment disguised as progress. Being told that their homes were unfit to live in did little to help when no affordable housing existed elsewhere. The memory of filth, however, remained powerful. Older residents remembered the worst years, the overpowering smells, the river thick with waste, the sudden deaths that struck without warning. These memories influenced how people responded to change. Some embraced reforms eagerly, desperate never to return to those conditions. Others resisted, wary of authorities who had ignored their suffering for decades and now claimed to act in their interest. Public spaces began to reflect new values. Streets were swept more regularly in central areas. Gas lighting improved visibility, making dirt harder to hide and crime easier to spot. Parks and promenades became symbols of civic pride, places where Londoners could experience a cleaner version of their city, even if only briefly. These spaces also reinforced class divisions, as some areas were carefully maintained while poorer districts lagged behind. Health outcomes slowly improved. Infant mortality rates declined, though they remained high by modern standards. Life expectancy crept upward. Doctors and officials began to understand patterns, how overcrowding, poor ventilation, and contaminated water worked together to weaken bodies. Hospitals expanded, and charity clinics offered limited care to the poor. Medicine remained crude, but it was becoming more systematic, more focused on prevention rather than reaction alone. The city's workforce adapted as well. Cleaner streets made transport more efficient. Improved drainage reduced flooding, allowing goods to move more reliably. These changes supported economic growth, reinforcing the idea that public health was not merely a moral issue but an economic necessity. A healthier population worked more consistently, cost less to treat, and posed fewer risks to social stability. Despite these gains, inequality remained deeply rooted. While some districts flourished, others stayed trapped in cycles of neglect. The East End, in particular, continued to struggle with overcrowding, low wages, and poor housing. Reform efforts often targeted visible problems while ignoring underlying causes. Filth could be swept away. Poverty could not. Many families continued to live one illness or job loss away from disaster. Cultural attitudes toward dirt also evolved. Filth was no longer accepted as inevitable, but it was still closely associated with poverty. Cleanliness became a marker of respectability, reinforcing social hierarchies. Those who failed to meet new standards were often judged harshly, even when circumstances made compliance nearly impossible. This moralization of cleanliness added a new layer to class prejudice. As the Victorian era approached its end, London existed in a state of uneasy balance. It was cleaner, healthier, and better organized than before, yet haunted by the memory of its past. The city had learned hard lessons about neglect and consequence. It had discovered that progress without planning could be deadly. These lessons would shape future policies, influencing how cities across the world approached growth, sanitation, and public health. Still, many questions remained unresolved. How far should the government intervene in private lives? Who should bear the cost of reform? Could cleanliness truly coexist with poverty, or would one always undermine the other? These debates simmered beneath the surface as London moved into a new century. As London stepped beyond the Victorian era and into the early years of the 20th century, the city carried its past with it like a shadow that never fully faded. The worst of the visible filth had been reduced, but the memory of overflowing streets, poisoned water, and choking air lingered deeply in the public consciousness. These memories shaped how Londoners thought about their city, and how future generations approached the idea of urban life itself. The reforms born from Victorian desperation did not simply disappear when Queen Victoria's reign ended. Instead, they hardened into systems, laws, and expectations. Clean water, functioning sewers, and waste removal were no longer optional improvements. They became basic requirements of a modern city. Municipal authorities expanded their responsibilities, accepting that neglect had consequences too severe to ignore. This shift marked a profound change in governance. Cities were no longer just centers of trade and power, but environments that directly influence human survival. Yet progress brought new challenges. As sanitation improved, population density continued to rise. London remained a magnet for workers, migrants, and opportunity seekers. Clean streets did not mean spacious homes. Overcrowding persisted, and while diseases like cholera receded, other illnesses tied to poverty and poor nutrition remained common. Tuberculosis, rickets, and respiratory conditions continued to claim lives quietly, especially among the poor. The city had learned how to move waste underground, but it still struggled to lift people out of hardship. Urban reformers increasingly understood that dirt was not only physical, social conditions, low wages, insecure employment, and inadequate housing created invisible forms of filth that sanitation alone could not wash away. Investigations into living conditions revealed that even clean streets could surround lives marked by exhaustion and despair. This realization pushed reform beyond engineering and into social policy, though progress in this area remained slow and contested. The memory of Victorian filth also influenced architecture and city design. New buildings emphasized light, airflow, and separation of spaces. Schools, hospitals, and public institutions were designed to look orderly and clean, reflecting the belief that environment shaped behavior. Cleanliness became associated with progress, morality, and civilization itself. This mindset would later influence everything from housing estates to zoning laws. At the same time, London's reputation evolved. No longer widely mocked as the dirtiest city in the world, it began to present itself as a model of reform, a city that had confronted disaster and survived. Engineers, planners, and public officials from other nations studied London's transformation, adapting its solutions to their own cities. Ironically, the city's darkest period became the source of its greatest influence. Still, beneath this sense of achievement, unease remained. Londoners knew how close the city had come to collapse. The Great Stink, the cholera epidemics, and the endless smoke were not ancient history. They were recent memory. This awareness created a cautious attitude toward growth. Expansion was no longer celebrated blindly. Questions were asked. Systems were tested. The city learned, painfully, that ignoring basic human needs could turn progress into catastrophe. Daily life reflected this caution. Water quality was monitored. Streets were inspected. Housing standards, though imperfect, were debated. Newspapers continued to report on public health, keeping pressure on officials. The idea that filth could return if vigilance failed became widely accepted. Cleanliness was no longer a luxury. It was a defense. Yet, for all its improvements, London never fully escaped its past. The poorest neighborhoods still bore scars of neglect. Inequality ensured that while some lived in comfort, others hovered dangerously close to the conditions of earlier decades. The city had changed, but not evenly. Progress, like filth once had, settled heavier in some places than others. As the city moved forward, it carried a paradox. It had become cleaner because it had once been unbearably dirty. Its systems were stronger because they had failed so dramatically before. Victorian London's filth had forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about urban life, responsibility, and survival. As time passed, the memory of Victorian London's filth became something more than history. It became a warning. Even as new generations were born into cleaner streets and safer water supplies, the stories of the past lingered in books, newspapers, and public debate. Parents told their children about the days when the river stank, when sickness arrived without warning, and when entire neighborhoods were swallowed by disease. These memories shaped behavior in quiet but powerful ways. Public officials learned to fear complacency, the idea that neglect could return the city to its former state-haunted planning decisions. Budgets for sanitation and public health were defended with references to past disasters. Inspectors became permanent figures in city life, checking drains, water sources, and housing conditions. While these measures sometimes felt oppressive to residents, they were widely tolerated because people remembered what happened when no one was watching. Education reinforced this collective memory. Schools taught basic hygiene alongside reading and arithmetic. Cleanliness was framed not just as a personal habit, but as a civic duty. Children learned that one careless act, polluting water, ignoring waste, overcrowding a space, could affect thousands. This sense of shared responsibility marked a major cultural shift. The city was no longer just a place people lived in. It was something they had to actively protect. Architecture continued to reflect these fears and lessons. New housing developments prioritized separation between living spaces and waste systems. Windows were larger, ceilings higher, and ventilation deliberately planned. Even modest homes were influenced by the belief that light and air were defenses against decay. Though not everyone benefited equally, the ideal itself shaped expectations. People came to believe that living surrounded by filth was not natural or acceptable. It was a failure of systems, not destiny. The press played a key role in preserving this vigilance. Newspapers frequently revisited the horrors of the past, especially during times of crisis. A foul smell, a polluted stream, or a sudden outbreak of illness could trigger comparisons to Victorian disasters. These reminders kept public pressure alive. Politicians who ignored sanitation risked public outrage, not sympathy. Dirt had become political, yet memory also carried distortion. As time passed, the poorest residents were sometimes unfairly blamed for conditions beyond their control. Cleanliness became associated with morality, and those who lived in deteriorating areas were judged harshly. The fear of filth, once rooted in real danger, sometimes transformed into fear of people themselves. This complicated legacy showed how deeply Victorian London's past had embedded itself into social attitudes. The city's identity evolved alongside this memory. London was no longer merely a place of empire and industry. It became a case study in survival. Its transformation was cited in debates about urbanization across the world. Cities growing rapidly looked to London as proof that disaster could be avoided if lessons were learned early enough. Engineers and planners borrowed its solutions, but also its cautionary tales. Despite technological advances, Londoners remained aware that progress could be fragile. Floods, strikes, wars, and economic downturns all tested the systems built to keep the city clean. Each crisis revived old fears. The question was never just whether London was clean now, but whether it could stay that way. The past had taught the city that decay could return faster than expected. This awareness shaped responses to new challenges. When pollution shifted from visible waste to invisible threats like chemicals and smog, the city responded more quickly than it once had. The memory of coal-blackened skies made people more willing to confront environmental dangers. Victorian filth had trained London to recognize warning signs before catastrophe struck. Still, the tension between growth and care never disappeared. London continued to expand, drawing people into its orbit. Each expansion carried the risk of repeating old mistakes. Planners walked a narrow path between development and neglect, always shadowed by the city's history. As the story approaches its final chapter, one truth becomes clear. Victorian London was known as the dirtiest city in the world, not simply because it was filthy, but because it revealed what happens when progress outruns responsibility. Its dirt was a symptom, not the disease. The filth forced a reckoning, one that reshaped how cities understood themselves. As we come to the end of this long journey through Victorian London, it becomes clear that the city's reputation as the, quote, dirtiest city in the world was not simply a label of shame, but a turning point in human history. London's filth was not meaningless chaos. It was the visible result of a society moving faster than its understanding, a warning written in sewage, smoke, and sickness. And from that warning, lasting change emerged. Victorian London showed the world what happens when progress ignores people. Industry created wealth, but without planning, that wealth piled up alongside waste. Streets became rivers of filth. The air turned heavy and black. Water, once a source of life, became a carrier of death. The city grew powerful, but its people paid the price with their health and their lives. This contrast between greatness and neglect is what made Victorian London unforgettable. What followed was not instant redemption, but slow learning. The city did not wake up clean one morning. Instead, it struggled, argued, delayed, and failed again and again. But each failure left a lesson behind. The Great Stink forced Parliament to act. Cholera outbreaks shattered old beliefs. Engineers, doctors, and reformers pushed against indifference. Bit by bit, London learned that filth was not fate. It was a problem that could be solved. This realization changed everything. Sewers were no longer invisible conveniences. They became lifelines. Clean water became a right, not a privilege. Waste was managed, not ignored. Streets were designed, not abandoned. The city learned to think below the surface, understanding that what lay underground mattered just as much as what stood above. Perhaps the most important legacy of Victorian London's filth was the shift in responsibility. Dirt was no longer seen as a personal failing alone, but as a collective issue. Health became public business. Sanitation became a duty of government. Urban life itself was redefined. A city was no longer just a place of commerce and power. It was an environment that could either protect life or destroy it. This transformation reached far beyond London. Cities across Europe and the world watched closely. They learned from London's mistakes without always repeating them. Sewer systems, public health boards, housing regulations, and environmental awareness all trace part of their origins back to the crisis that once made London unbearable. In this way, the dirtiest city in the world helped shape the cleanest ideas of the modern age. Yet the story is not one of simple triumph. Even as London improved, inequality remained. Filth retreated, but poverty lingered. Clean streets did not guarantee fair wages or safe homes for everyone. The city became healthier, but not equal. Victorian London teaches us that infrastructure alone cannot fix injustice. It can only prevent disaster. The deeper work of fairness takes longer, and it is never fully finished. Still, the change was real. The choking smoke lifted slowly. The river began to recover. Death came less suddenly. Children lived longer. The city learned to breathe again. London did not erase its past. It absorbed it, built over it, and remembered it. Today, when we walk through modern cities with underground sewers, clean drinking water, waste collection, and public health systems, we are walking through the legacy of Victorian London's suffering. Every drain, every pipe, every sanitation rule carries the memory of a time when these things did not exist, and when their absence proved deadly. Victorian London was dirty not because its people were careless, but because they were pioneers in a world changing faster than knowledge could keep up. Their struggle gave future generations something invaluable: awareness. The awareness that cities must care for their weakest. That progress must be balanced with responsibility. That ignoring filth, physical or social, always carries a cost. So when history remembers Victorian London as the dirtiest city in the world, it should also remember it as the city that forced humanity to learn how to live together in vast numbers. Its filth became a lesson, its suffering became a foundation, and its transformation became a quiet promise that even the most broken systems can change. As the city settled into the modern age, the sounds of carts and coughing faded into memory. Gas lamps gave way to electric light. Sewers flowed silently beneath clean streets. The great city slept differently now, not free of problems, but wiser than before. And now, as this story comes to rest, imagine Victorian London at night. The streets are quieter. The river moves slowly beneath the bridges. The smoke thins. The city, once drowning in its own waste, finally exhales. Thank you for traveling through this history. If you found peace in this slow journey through the past, remember to like and subscribe for more stories meant to calm the mind and carry you gently into rest. Good night.